Speaker, make it clear.
Order.
Well, I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight are my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. She is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies and lectures at Massey Uni, blogger Phoebe Fletcher. And he is the editor of independent news site, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, should the thin blue line be armed after a spate of attacks on police over the holidays? Issue 2, what will be the biggest challenge for the government in 2013? The Ipka Urewera report, the Sky City Casino cronyism report, the Kim.com case, or the Supreme Court ruling on Māori water rights. And issue 3 tonight, with 7.3% unemployment, 270,000 kids in poverty, and the highest inequality ever recorded. What has to happen in the economy for New Zealand in 2013 for everyone to start prospering? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. A spate of attacks on police over the holiday season have prompted calls to arm officers, while questions loom over the tactics used by police and each of the examples given. In Dargaville on Christmas Day, 2 officers were beaten after they accidentally pepper sprayed a 9-year-old child in the face, while different versions of the arrest in Kawhia, where a police officer lost his Glock after drawing it for outstanding traffic violations, don't seem to justify handing out the guns just yet. Phoebe, should the New Zealand police be armed at all times? Talkback Radio seems to think it does.
I think that there are serious issues around the police being armed and in fact even tasers. I mean, one of the things that I think about immediately is that 2010 Auckland University study where they found that, for example, tasers were only being pulled on 10% of criminal attacks and being used on 27% of attacks that were related to people with mental illness.
Right.
So I think that there are serious issues around the kind of situations that police go into. I know that, for example, there were headlines last year that said that police are currently under an increasing amount of stress, and this is not something that I blame police for, because I think it would be incredibly stressful going into those situations by yourself.
Sure.
But I think one of the issues, or one of the key arguments around this, is that the moment that you introduce more guns or more weapons into the equation, then A, you're aggravating people that are already aggravated, and B, you're increasing the odds that there is going to be a serious incident.
So, and Kim Workman from Rethinking Crime and Punishment points out that the rate of assault per sworn police officer has barely changed over the last decade. Where is this call to arm police coming from? And what would the ramifications of a largely untrained police force handling guns every day?
Yeah, the call is coming from the Police Association, which is, and somewhat people would say is the police union. To me, the examples that we have seen in the last couple of weeks are not even the extreme end of this. That they're more in the area of requiring an examination of remote kind of police patches, if you like, or police jurisdictions where you have one officer out there in confronting what can be explosive situations. That's where the debate should be, not over the arming, etc., etc. That incident in Kawhia illustrates that the police already have ready access to firearms, even when they're on standard type patrols.
Sure.
The call to have the gun on the hip, I think, is folly here in New Zealand, and I think that because I think we can look across to Britain, and it's one of the things where we can watch and observe where the status quo is non-armed on the hip type cops on the beat. We have an armed offenders squad, obviously, for extreme situations. But once again, I think, one, the frontline police, particularly when they're on their own, they need to make sure, the police need to make sure that those officers have the opportunity to develop advanced negotiating skills instead of negotiation failure skills. That has got to be the first thing. I'm not even talking from a liberal point of view, I'm talking from a pragmatic, practical point of view.
In Kawhia we had the situation, didn't we, where the fire department was sort of used as a backup. That's a big deal, is it not, to mix their skills and their services together like that?
Yeah, it is a big deal. Now, what it does show, I think, that resolution to the problem, to that crisis, at that incident, was done by others who came in from outside the altercation and basically resolved the problem. That shows that there were two groups obviously going head to head, one an officer and then a group of others, for whatever reasons, in an explosive situation. It comes back to the argument that negotiating skills, high-end negotiating skills, should be mandatory for everyone. If you put, for example, guns on the hips of those remote rural cops, and every one of them is kind of wearing that in, you're going to get incidents like the Stephen Wallace shooting occurring again. The problem, sorry to go on, but the problem that was relating to the Stephen Wallace shooting, part of the problem is that you had an officer in charge who had been highly armed offenders trained, and he hadn't been decommissioned or detrained, if you like, for frontline rural positions.
So he went there with the intention to pull a gun.
Well, that was the explanation of why, when Stephen Wallace was shot and he was down, that the officers stood there and marked the person for a long time, not letting anyone get to his aid. That was armed offenders protocol. It was not frontline police.
Can I just interject and extend there? The situation in Kawhia where you had the fire department come in, some of the people that arrived in terms of the fire department were actually related to the people engaged in the brawl. And, they were seen as aunties that were intermediaries and able to calm that situation down. I think that the community meeting that they've had in Kawhia is excellent, and I would endorse what Selwyn is talking about a need for a kind of integrated community approach to these sorts of solutions.
Do we want guns pulled on people for what is effectively traffic violations? Isn't that a very low standard to give the state in terms of policing its citizens?
I think it is a very low standard, and it reminds me of an incident that happened in Los Angeles last time that I was there, where there had been someone that had robbed a t-shirt shop, and the robber went in with a gun. The guy at the t-shirt shop pulls out the gun. They both shoot each other dead. You know, and that happened while I was there. This is why I think that there should be very strict regulations around the use of guns, and I think that this is something that a lot of New Zealanders feel quite strongly about.
I was watching one of New Zealand's numerous police TV reality shows last night, and it effectively was police hassling young brown youth with very little justification to be hassling them at all. Are we conditioned to obey authority and not question police tactics?
Well, I think to some extent we are. I mean, when you say that question, I immediately think, of course, of the former TVNZ chief that said that Māori representation on Police 10-7 constituted a representation of New Zealand under the Charter.
Sure.
I think in terms of the idea of are we conditioned to be used to it, the idea that might constitute representation says in some senses that we are. I think the issues around things like alcohol, drugs, but these are secondary to the problems that you have in these areas of extremely high youth unemployment. Like, these are the kind of central issues that we've got to look at. They are community focused and based. I mean, Northland, we're up to what, a third of youth unemployed now. So it really doesn't surprise me that we are having these incidences in these sorts of places.
Is police action an appropriate way to deal with that?
Well, I think that there's a dialogue that has got to occur between the police and the community, and I'm happy to see that beginning in Kawhia.
Yeah, community liaison kind of efforts in the proactive policing areas really needs to be targeted funding. There's been such a political emphasis on urgent response and the front end of policing in a reactionary way that it's missing, the debate and also the funding is missing out in the proactive policing initiatives. That was something that really was being advanced from 2000 through to 2005, and it's sad to see that the political will has been taken out of that.
Final question to both of you: is it just a matter of time before the New Zealand police become regularly armed?
I hope not.
I don't believe so, Bomber. I think that it's a long way away from taking that silly decision.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. What will be the biggest challenge for the government in 2013. The damning IPCA report on police tactics used during the Urewera terrorist trial, the report into the Sky City casino cronyism, the GCSB collusion with America are about to be highlighted in the Kim.com case, or the Supreme Court ruling on Māori water rights. Selwyn, the Independent Police Conduct Authority have finished their report into the police actions during the Urewera terrorism trial that is apparently incredibly damning of the police. The police in turn have done all they can to smother and prevent the IPCA report becoming public. What will the fallout from this be?
Well, I'd like to see it placed within a context of what we've been seeing over the last 12 months too. We had news reports and the realisation that the police were illegally operating in Nelson relating to taking a particular case to the courts. There is police conduct here at the highest level, at the planning level, that we saw in the Kim.com raids, that is working outside the law.
Well, they had retrospective legislation passed to allow them all off the hook for this, didn't they?
Yeah, you were talking about the Urewera raids there, but what I'm talking about, I guess, is seeing where the trends are, where the complacency is, where the strategic kind of goal of doing this is justified, tactics to get there are justified goal, and those tactics being awry of the law to large degrees. That is the kind of thing, the kind of debate where one, you establish the facts and the information, and then you've got a solid kind of foundation of knowledge, haven't you? And then the proper debate can come through on what should be done about this. My gut feeling on this is not really good enough, but it does appear from placing it along a timeline, or just detailed there, that there are major concerns, major problems within police at operational level that really the Office of the Commissioner must address.
If these are the sorts of tactics they were pulling inside the law, should New Zealanders be concerned with the vast new powers they now have under the Search and Surveillance Act?
Yeah, well, I do think so. Where the police feel they have cause is different to whether or not the police do have cause.
Right.
And that is always really the balancing principle behind these types of things. Yes, the Parliament has passed in its majority laws, and like you have alluded to, retrospective laws that justify a particular operation and the means of acquiring information or arrest. That doesn't necessarily mean that it can not be mishandled. And once again, I come back to this thing, that the culture within the police, as we saw under the major reviews at the latter part of the Clark-led government into the culture of police, I feel that it needs to be revisited again.
Should we be concerned they've now got a drone? The police, New Zealand police, have been able to. TV3 revealed at the end of last year they've got military technology and are using a drone now.
Yeah, and the odd thing is every individual in this country who has the will and the means can have a drone too.
Yeah. Phoebe, the Audit Office inquiry into the Sky City Convention Centre for Pokies deal has been written and immediately sat upon because it is highly critical of the government for being so involved in the deal. What ramifications are there in John Key pimping for a casino?
I think there are some quite huge ramifications here. I mean, that tendering process was obviously very flawed. I actually happen to agree with the Greens on this when they criticised last month the fact that the report had been written and sent out to all of the interested parties, including Sky City. Now, is it really an independent report if the Auditor General is sending it out to Sky City for review before it is publicly released to the media? I think there are some quite serious issues that are coming up around this convention case in regards to lobbying, and I think that this is something that the Greens have pushed forward last year. We saw a lot of resistance, and the main players that we saw on television were all people who happened to be in the pocket
of Sky City.
Of these major companies. So I think that this has the ability to become an ongoing political issue in that it taps into the stuff that has already happened with John Banks and the way that he has been tarnished by accepting an envelope from them.
Does it question John Key as a Prime Minister? Should the Prime Minister of the country be as personally involved in cutting deals with companies as he seems to be?
No, I think there needs to be some political independence, and certainly more political independence in the media. I mean, we also had a scandal last year where there were certain media figures that had been taking envelopes of money off Sky City and getting rooms in exchange for promoting them. So
and they were current affairs hosts, and this
Yeah.
issue didn't really pop up much on any of their...
Yeah, so I think, in regards to Sky City, I am with the Greens on this, absolutely. I'm very interested in seeing the Auditor General's report. I'm highly concerned that that is being sent out for review by Sky City before it even gets released. I mean, that has to raise some alarm bells.
If Sky City would like to pay me to not go to their casino, they can do that too. Selwyn MediaWorks has just dumped 500 adverts for Kim.com's new mega upload service at a request of the recording industry. Apparently, highlighting the interests and powers of those lining up against .com. What level of collusion between the GCSB and the American security agencies can the government get away with here?
Yeah, there are two things running there. Whether or not the government has had a role in trying to strong arm MediaWorks is not been established as far as I've seen. But it does show some pretty powerful commercial players that are pressurising there. It would be very handy to have MediaWorks as a communicating company to communicate the reality of what has gone on there. Because in this country, unless something is defamatory or it's hate speech, or etc., you kind of expect that a commercial body can actually express a commercial or an advertisement through a legitimate broadcaster. It's a very strange thing. One would imagine too, as I think Kim.com said, that MediaWorks generally has some very good people working at it that have been trying to put in the editorial side some balance into this whole .com raid, .com situation. And you've got to acknowledge that. Whereabouts inside MediaWorks has this particular extreme, in my view, decision of censorship been born? And who are the players? I know these are I'm answering with a lot of questions.
But there are a lot of questions.
There are a lot of questions. If the government was found to have had its hand in this whole affair, well, then that is starting to get very, very creepy and should really be exposed in the right way.
What if the court case connects the GCSB into having have had the knowledge and working with the Americans much closer than they have
on that issue, which is a separate issue? I think that's obviously going to be the case. I mean, the most interesting thing that is because what we found through 2012 would suggest in a reasonable way that was the case. What we are doing though is we're seeing where the High Court judge in that proceeding is ordering the GCSB to appear. Now that's a fascinating thing. It's almost like in what we saw in the 2000s when the judiciary had a gutsful of the Labor-led government's approach on the Zowie case, and it was saying we are not going to bow to the Prime Minister's demands here, and you're seeing this with the judiciary over .com at the moment. Fascinating that the GCSB gives testimony.
Phoebe, if the Supreme Court rule against the government's asset sale plan because of Māori water rights, what happens?
Well, I think that there's already going to be headaches around this, and we're seeing this over the last couple of weeks with Treasury issuing its advice that it's just not possible to float all of the companies next year, that the share prices are going to go down, and that the market is only really big enough to...
We talked about this last year.
Didn't we?
About the consequences
did talk about
of a desperate seller.
But I think either way, whatever the Supreme Court rules, I think that there are going to be big issues around this in the National Party. I think that we've begun to see Chris Farfoy come out, that this will become a serious attack point for Labor. The fact that we now have Treasury saying this future investment fund is not going to receive that $5 to $7 billion if they flood the market. Now, for National, that was a key election platform, so that's going to be something that they will be trying to tie off by the end of their term.
So even if they win, even if they win in the court, the actual situation within the market will rob them of the value that they've hoped for. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think that's what Treasury are already signalling. And although Treasury have a reputation for sometimes misreading their forecasts, I think that this is actually quite a sensible intervention here. Is that the market is too small? They're going to flood it.
One great conspiracy online at the moment is the idea that Key would go for an early election if the Supreme Court didn't go his way. How likely is that at the end of the year?
I suppose it's possible, but it depends on the way that the media pick up on it
Right.
and the way that it plays out. Like, I think that, there are some in National that want that third term. I think that there's a recognition among a lot of people within National that it's quite hard to get as well. I think, it's
Final
possible.
question to both of you. What other icebergs could strike the National Party this year?
Gee, I think all of them kind of are born within these four issues that you've outlined there. Certainly on the economic front, Bill English, irrespective of whether or not they win any court cases, they've been delayed relating to the sale of the partial sale of the state assets. Yep, every reasonably minded person knows you dump a whole lot of stuff. If you're desperate to sell and you dump it to sell, you're going to get a lot less than what you anticipated. Bill English has got a budget that he's currently negotiating with every cabinet minister at the moment, trying to divvy up money into those areas. They're short. It means borrowing big or slashing big in the budget.
And they're panicking because we've just had cabinet issue guidelines about how ministers can actually even discuss these issues.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, the government's response to our economic malaise is the business growth agenda. It will focus on export markets, skilled and safe workplaces, capital markets, natural resources and infrastructure. But is this fiddling on the stuff that doesn't make much impact the right environment for growth? Selwyn, 7.3% unemployment, 270,000 kids in poverty and the highest inequality ever recorded. How will the government's business growth agenda impact on any of those issues?
Well, it's very difficult to see it making gains considering what we just talked about, with its fiscal problems domestically, but also, fundamental to any area of economic growth is creating the opportunities for those income earning areas in the private sector to be able to do so.
And we're gutting manufacturing.
We're gutting manufacturing, but more than that, the government is saying to all exporters, all stakeholder groups, all manufacturers, the status quo is satisfactory. We do not need to do something about the exchange rate. Well, I'm sorry, the exchange rate is fundamental to the prosperity in this country, and it is having a detrimental effect of stifling the opportunity of anybody reaching their potential at the moment. The government is saying it's satisfactory. Others in the parliament are saying it's not satisfactory, and I tend to kind of agree with the latter.
Phoebe, the doyen of the right, Fran O'Sullivan, criticised Key heavily in the Herald this week over his lack of plans to tackle youth unemployment. National source much of their vote from small business New Zealand, yet their policy is focused mainly on the interests of monopolies. When does that disconnect start hurting National?
Oh, I think, part of the problem here is that the way that people vote is quite often on push-pull issues.
Right.
And around youth, we have things like boot camps or, the idea that we've got these lazy youth that just can't get into jobs, 90-day right to hire and fire and so on. I think, it should already be biting them, but I think we've not really had an effective opposition on that, although hopefully, there might be some more discussion beginning to come up. I note on what Selwyn was just saying that Bernard Hickey just did a very good piece for Gareth Morgan, where he was talking about that exchange rate and also the idea that we have debt increasing again in New Zealand. That's what we're seeing. And, this is something that the IMF have also said on New Zealand, that our big problem is private debt, and we're beginning to see that rise again. So, his argument was that we need to look at countries like Israel that have taken moves to...
That's all absolutely fine. Our private debt and public debt, what we owe overseas, is the fundamental problem. It's the current account deficit. The government has been doing nothing to address the current account deficit except to say, all you people out there, stop buying things and save. That's not
that
going to
IMF report, though, does actually look at private debt. The way that our dollar is overinflated is part of our overinvestment in the property market.
Is the private debt in New Zealand, that's a legacy of user pays, would you say? Where we transferred
there's so many things to that. I mean, some would say the biggest contributor is the free availability of credit, of being able to borrow. That drives up. So if you've got a housing market, the banks are able to put so much money into it that people are able to, I'll get that for an extra $100,000. So it increases the private debt. But the private debt domestically, you're sure. But that does not actually resolve the fundamentals imbalances in the New Zealand economy, where the current account deficit has been the legacy of the 90s.
Final question to both of you on this then. The predictions on the economy in 2013 have already been downgraded by Treasury. Will we see growth this year?
It's hard to say, not much, I would say.
Are
Once
we
it-
going to see growth this year?
Well, once again, you need to define growth in what areas. There is signs of consumer confidence and business confidence starting to spark after the last quarter of 2012. But growth as far as the economy is concerned, I would say that when the budget comes along, the realisation in the first quarter, so by September, will be that the deficit has been actually, the government has been trying to reduce the deficit once again by deferring the Christchurch rebuilds and all of these types of things, trying to hold it on, trying to hold it off. The asset sales, their partial asset sales, remember that their whole economic plan is funded
based on that. That's
Based on
right.
that,
That's
yes.
right. That's right.
It's falling apart.
Yeah. Let's wrap the show with the final word. Phoebe, your final word this week is?
My final word would have to be on the drones. I mean, I think that this is a further erosion of privacy that we've seen since the Search and Surveillance Bill passed, and I have real issues with the idea that the police are getting drones that can just sort of fly around and spy on people. I think that citizens actually really need to take a look at the kind of civil liberties they are losing in this country.
Is it acceptable to have military-grade spying equipment available to the police to spy on the public?
Well, I think that there needs to be strict regulations around that, and that's something that we lost on last year.
Yeah. Final word, Selwyn.
An interesting thing with the Foreign Secretary from the United Kingdom being down here in New Zealand over the last week, questions as to why has he made another visit to New Zealand. Remember, it's to this region. We do know that the UK is wanting to re-establish connections with Canada, Australia and New Zealand in a strategic way. What it means for New Zealand, though, in the news that we have had relating to sharing embassy space where the British have embassies around the globe, it starts to undermine New Zealand's independence in its foreign affairs and trade areas and restricts our growth to outposts around areas to Britain's strategic interests. And that, I think, is another step away from our wonderful Pacific Island state brand that we once had and being one where we're reconnecting to the old ways of US-Britain type led relationships.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Selwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word, the sudden resignation of TVNZ news boss Ross Dagan after a mere 10 months in the job suddenly makes 7 Sharp look terribly blunt. The reality is that 7 Sharp is a cost-cutting exercise away from expensive current affairs shows to cheap light entertainment. It would be the much-lamented death of intelligent television if Close Up wasn't already so brain-dead when the plug was finally pulled. When these types of panel shows work overseas, they work because there is a genuine subversive quality to them. I think we can all agree 7 Sharp won't be subversive. It will be very, 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 very news light. Imagine Anna Samways from Herald's Sideswipe column interviewing Barack Obama. That will be 7 Sharp. Expect a lot of flash mob bullshit, the Prime Minister dancing Gangnam styles, and Greg Boyd sobbing as his career melts before his eyes. Why watch 7 Sharp when you can watch something sharp at 7? Face TV launches on Sky 89 and Auckland UHF February the 1st. Don't you deserve harder questions than TVNZ will give you? If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.